This is not a technical talk, by the way. There are a lot of skills we're going to talk about, but no coding or development or things like that. Sometimes it's nice to have a break from those talks at DrupalCon. There are plenty of them. That being said, it's full of info, so buckle up. All right, let's jump in. Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Nate Lampkin. I'm a web developer and the training lead at MIT Sloan, the business school for MIT. And we're going to talk today about how we can build web confidence through those training processes. Let's jump into an agenda here. We're already halfway through the introduction, but I'm going to talk a little bit of background about who I am, what we do at MIT. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the training process that we developed. And then the bulk of this talk is actually section 4. It's like 85% of the talk. We're going to just dissect that process pretty thoroughly. I've broken that out into 3 stages of the training process. We're going to look at all of them. And then hopefully by the end of this, we'll wrap up and you'll have some things you can take away and bring back to your process. One disclaimer, this talk does not teach you how to do the one best way to do a training because it doesn't exist, okay? So hopefully throughout the talk, you'll find little bits, tidbits here and there that are really going to be useful to you, that you can implement some of them in your process. Others might not work really well for you. So don't think that all of it has to apply to you. All right, without further ado, let's jump in. Who am I, where do I work, and what does our website look like? Well, I'm Nate Lampkin. I'm a full stack developer and the training lead at MIT. I have a background in technical writing, and I'm also a photographer. Here's a really questionable self-portrait I took of myself when I had slightly worse facial hair. All right, so MIT, that's where I work. I work out of the Office of Communications for the Sloan School of Management. It's the business school for MIT. We manage all the external facing websites, so none of the internal infrastructure that students or faculty use for their coursework, entirely separate department. But we instead cater towards prospective students and other interested parties. Our major target audience is what we like to call future and current global business leaders. We also have a fantastic in-house editorial team that publishes articles on the daily on all of these topics. I don't expect you to read them all. We have one Drupal instance with over 60 independently managed site sections, with over 100 active site editors who've logged in the last 6 months. And we also have a WordPress multi-site for faculty that we don't talk about quite as loudly. All right, so we're already through the background. Let's talk about the process that we developed. Before I do any of that, I really think the training can take a village. So as you will learn throughout the talk today, I do none of this alone. I'd like to introduce you to Kagan, Kirsten, and Karen. Whenever I mention my team or the product team, these are my fantastic partners that I want you to be picturing. Quite literally, none of this would happen without them because they schedule all of our trainings, and it turns out that's a very important part. Close to 85% of the time, they're also in one of our trainings with me. They're all capable presenters and trainers on their own, so they can step in when I'm unavailable, which really takes a load off my chest. If it's not clear, I have a pretty awesome team, and I'm lucky to work with them. But who do we train? Well, we train a lot of different types of people. For example, we work with support staff for individual faculty or the degree programs at MIT. This is an example of our MBA site section, and they manage all of the data for these lovely infograms that you see here. We teach communications coordinators, administrative staff, and people who help out at all of the many research centers, labs, and funding initiatives that go on at MIT Sloan. Here we have the IWER, which is the MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research. We also work with all of the various administrative offices around campus, such as the very important DEI office, or the Office of Alumni Affairs, which is shown here. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna grab water. These users all range wildly from folks who have never logged into a CMS before to those who have worked on many sites in the past and are real content experts. Their responsibilities also range pretty wildly, from needing to create maybe like 1 or 2 events in the system, like every 6 months, to some of our more ambitious site editors who are making near daily updates to completely customize the content on their site section. Once our users are trained, they independently manage all of the content within their site sections. We're, of course, there to help whenever they need it, whether that's functionality-wise, on like how to do something in Drupal, that would be covered by me, or content strategy, we also provide assistance on that. That's that product team I showed you before. But our users are the masters of their site sections and their information, and they do it all on their own. So it's really important we get them started on a good foot. So before I joined the team in like late 2021, our previous trainings were extremely dense. There was like this whole PowerPoint presentation that lasted like 15 minutes before we even logged into Drupal. We found that our users were getting really overwhelmed before they were even learning any of the skills that they needed. And we weren't really able to make much progress on this until we made a pretty significant focus shift from exhaustive information sharing, where we're trying to cram everything in there at once, to just focusing on building user confidence in those original sessions. We did this by leveraging two things: excellent user documentation. Ours happens to be written by developers. We can't really publish anything if we don't update our documentation on it. And then it gets checked by our product experts. Ours is built in Confluence, and while they're not a sponsor, we do find their tools pretty great. My favorite is the glossary functionality. You can like define a term, use it throughout your whole documentation, and then anytime a user encounters it, you can like hover over it, and it will find that definition for you. You only have to update that definition once for all of those pages to get it. That's my favorite feature. But I digress. We also really rely on some strong follow-up communication across campus with our stakeholders. The Office of Communications manages much more than just our websites. I could run down the list from media preparedness trainings for our faculty whenever they have something published that goes wide. We have that fantastical editorial output that I mentioned before. We also have a few podcasts that go out internally to the MIT community. Those are executive produced out of our office. Obviously, I could fill this entire hour with all the cool special projects that go on out of the Office of Communications, but what I'm trying to express here is that we're literally leveraging, in some cases, relationships that were built across decades. And that's really like the backbone of how we're able to do some of this. Something I'm really proud of, though, is how my team's success with our trainings has been able to contribute back to that goodwill. The word of mouth about the ease of use on our web platform started to bubble up to decision makers. We had managers who were seeing quicker results, hearing fewer complaints from their reportees, and that in turn encouraged more stakeholders to seek out our office for support, not just for the website, but for all the things I mentioned before, and that felt really great. All right, talked a lot of background there. Let's look at some quick stats about our trainings. We've completed close to 60 user trainings since April 2022. 90% of those are online. Of that remaining 10%, 100% have the option to just do it online if they didn't want to come in person, but sometimes it's fun to do that. Our trainings are scheduled for roughly 60 minutes. The longest we've done was 95 minutes. We had a user who had so many PDFs and was so overwhelmed. I didn't have anything on my calendar afterwards, so we stuck around and we got a lot done. It's pretty great. Our shortest trainings are always 0 minutes, and that's when people forget to show up. But our actual shortest was like 25 minutes. We had 2 users who were only interested in learning how to program events on the site, and it was quite clear they didn't want to learn anything else. So we covered just the bare minimum there. It's clear they weren't really interested in much more, and I gave them their time back. It was pretty good. Most of our trainings are just with an individual user. That's usually 2 trainers, myself and someone from the product team, with 1 user, which is a pretty good ratio. But we do some other ones as well. Our largest group that was a hybrid before, the most difficult training I've ever done, was 17 participants with 5 online and 12 in person. Difficult to juggle that. But about 3 months ago, we did our largest training, which, believe it or not, was much easier because it was entirely online with 46 people watching what I was doing in Drupal on a screen. Anyway. All right, so what does our process look like? I know this slide is super ugly, but spoiler alert, it's going to come back and improve multiple times throughout this talk. So bear with me while we look at this ugly gray one. I'm going to read you through how our process goes right now. It starts when someone reaches out to the Office of Communications for a training. That usually happens over email or Slack. Then the product team is going to respond to that request. They're going to ask a little bit about what that user might need, and then they're also going to schedule the training. From there, they're going to send an email to the trainer. That's usually me. It's then my responsibility to review that summary of what that user might need and prepare what I think that user's going to, skills and things that the user's going to need most. Then in the middle there, we have the main event. That's the training. That's that 60 to 2 hour window. In the last 2 minutes of every training, I talk about some expectations for a follow-up email that I really encourage. This is really critical because it sort of bridges the phase between the training phase and what to expect for long-term support. Afterwards, users are granted access to the CMS. Sometimes this may happen during the training as well. We might do some hands-on things, but for flow reasons, it's down on the bottom. After that, the product team will send the follow-up email I told them about, and finally, we'll enter that long-term support phase that is indefinite. It's still ongoing for everybody I've trained right now. Awesome, that was a lot to cover, but we're gonna dive straight into how I would diagram and dissect that process here. Like I said earlier, I've broken this out into 3 stages. We're gonna cover all 3 of these. For each of them, we're gonna talk about the surface level task that you have to accomplish, the core goal that you're trying to meet, and a hidden objective, which is my favorite part, and it's what I'm gonna talk about the most, sort of like a technique. After each of these, we're gonna pause. I'm gonna encourage you to take out some notes, maybe pull out a text document or something, because I'm gonna ask a bunch of leading questions. And your answers to those questions are what you're gonna take away from this talk. That's the important stuff, not everything I have to say. But we're gonna dive into the information, and your answers to those questions will help you implement or find the gaps in your current training process so you can add some of these things in there. All right, so each stage is gonna have a surface level task. This is really straightforward. It's like the bare minimum that we need to accomplish. If we don't accomplish this, we failed, we didn't succeed, we could pack it up and go home because this stage is not gonna work. More importantly though, we have a core goal. This is like the guiding principle or the ethos of this stage. It's really often deeply related to the surface level task, but in a weird way, it's kind of the opposite. Because if the surface level task is how we gauge failure, the core goal becomes the metric that we're gonna gauge our success upon. Lastly, I mentioned before, we got that hidden objective. This is the hardest to wrap your brain around, but don't worry, it's the one we're gonna cover most in depth for each of these. I like to think of it like the secret mission or the technique that you can use to help us achieve that core goal. The other weird thing about the hidden objective is that when done right, it's largely invisible to our users. They don't even know it happened, and that's kind of fun. All right, with all that preamble done, let's jump into our first stage. This is the planning and scheduling stage. I like to think of it as that knowledge gathering phase. Some of you laughed earlier when I said that scheduling was important. It actually really is. It's an entire stage of our training. So the knowledge gathering stage looks a little bit like this. I promised some improvements. It's everything in green here. I'm not gonna go over them again. We already ran down that list. But everything that happens before the training is to set us up for success. What's our surface level task here? I'm telling you, these are dead simple. We're literally trying to put a meeting on everybody's calendars so that we make some progress here. Once that's done, what's our core goal? Well, we're trying to identify any possible topics, tasks, skills, or workflows that are gonna be critical areas that we can focus on during that upcoming training. If we can get all this information ahead of time, we can set the trainer up for success. But that sounds like a lot of work, right? It's a lot to do for every training, and it's even more for that trainer to prepare. Don't worry though, that's where our hidden objective comes in. We're secretly trying to gather just enough information to drop our users into some kind of persona bucket. Personas are probably a known quantity at DrupalCon, but just in case you don't know what this term means, personas are like a pattern, but for people. They're like a collection of similar traits or requirements that together represent one kind of archetypal user. And once you've identified a few personas, you can then create templated trainings that match those buckets. And once you get good at this, you can do that with relatively little information about a user. The 3 factoids that we often collect at MIT Sloan are experience level with web tools, the job title that new user has entered into, or maybe the department that they joined. And this one's perhaps unique to Sloan, but we find it's really useful to know how long that user has worked at the institution, because it tells us a lot about the kinds of tasks and information they're gonna need to access on the website. All right, maybe people haven't thought about personas with trainees before, so I'm gonna show you what the 3 primary trainee personas that we use at MIT Sloan. We've got reluctant site editors, we've got self-conscious content experts, and what I call the junior power users. First, let's go with those reluctant site editors. These are like support staff that someday suddenly woke up and found maintains and updates web content as a bullet in their job description. They've maybe heard of Wordspace or SquarePress, maybe Drupal, that sounds familiar to them, but they're not excited to be learning a new tech or a new tool. I often find that drawing parallels to other tools that they're more familiar with can be really useful here. So common touchstones I rely on pretty heavily are like email templates or Google Forms. A lot of people have touched those. Again, these users might only have one or two specific tasks that they've been assigned in the system, and that's often all they want to learn about. It's important not to overwhelm these users because they might not actually log into your system for a few days, maybe a few weeks. I had an honest confession that one of our users didn't log in for 3 months after our first training. So yeah, it's really critical that if they only have a few things to do and they're not going to log in for a long period of time, we just give them the bare minimum that they need to accomplish their tasks and let them go. Next up, we got those self-conscious content experts. These users know their stuff, but they don't know their tools. They might already have some kind of incomplete understanding of how to work within the system. Maybe they got no formal training when they first started out. Maybe they started out as a reluctant site editor before. But as their responsibilities grew over time, they've taught themselves different things, and they often have one way of accomplishing their task that currently works for them. They're really afraid that if they deviate from that pathway and what they already know, everything's going to break, the site's going to come crashing down around them, and it's going to be the end of the world. But if we can use this training time to instead fill in the gaps in their confidence, assure them that things aren't quite as fragile as they once thought, they're usually going to take off like a rocket. They might even hop into the driver's seat for you. They might lead the training with really thoughtful questions that they didn't even know were possible in your system before you showed it to them. One confidence builder that I really like to use for these people is something I call the surprise pop quiz. This is secretly the easiest softball question that you could pose to somebody about what you've covered at the beginning of your training. And sometimes the panic for these users of being put on the spot and then knocking it out of the park can go a long way to show them that's not quite as hard as they think. I like to try and let them direct the flow of a training or conversation whenever possible, but I don't want them to get lost in the details, right? Because they might have some of those old habits that are still tripping them up, and it's important to use this face-to-face moment to stomp those out. I actually find that these trainings are sometimes the most satisfying that I will do, because usually the user's coming in with a little bit of frustration, some tension at the start. They have something they wish the system could be doing for them, and it's not working right now. But when you can sit there with them, build that confidence, and help them make that connection, watching that click for them just feels really great. So these are my favorite trainings. Last up, we got our junior power users. Sometimes people have a love-hate relationship with these users. I have what I try to keep a very loving relationship with them. So to borrow from a Drupal term here, these are your ambitious site builders. They might come in with any amount of experience before, but what sets them apart is their ability to pick up new tech quickly and their motivation to tinker with those new tools. Sometimes, though, they can fall into the trap of overestimating their ability here. They get into a run before they can sort of walk type scenario. But if we can start with a solid foundation and help them feel one step ahead with each question they're going to ask, they're really going to love that face-to-face time. One strategy that I like to use here is that I often pretend that I'm giving them some kind of insider info. I peel back the curtain for them, and they get really excited about this, like they're learning something other people don't know. This is also a really great way to gauge if they're actually absorbing the information that you're putting down, because if you drop them in the deep end and they can't swim, really easy red flag that it's time to roll back to our foundations and set a better example. It's really important that you don't let yourself get pushed over by these users. You can course correct whenever necessary. That might look something like this. Whoa, that's a great question. We're actually headed right there next. But I just need to make sure we cover these last elements of how we save a page, because if we can't do that, you're not going to have much success editing the site. So just hold that question for now. We're going to get there. If you do a good job on these trainings, though, power users are going to become your MVP, stress tester extraordinaires. They're going to be the first ones to find all of your new bugs, if you like that or not. They're going to be typically pretty patient as you fix them, because they take some pride in the fact that they found it. They're also going to offer lots of feedback on the pain points that are existing in your system, which is really useful for you to be able to make improvements for everybody. So while these trainings are by far the most demanding, difficult power users are often absolute gems when you train them right. All right, when I showed some of these training buckets to some of my colleagues, my colleague Karen summarized them really, really well. She wrote that templated trainings help us balance general introduction to our web platform with the user's individual needs. This increases the value for our training time for all participants involved. All right, that was a lot of info on how we schedule our trainings and how we get started. But now I'm going to ask you those questions I promised before. So, everybody, please take out some notes, something you can jot down some answers on, whether that's a new text document or something. Blank piece of paper works great. We're going to run down some of those leading questions now. And again, your answers to these are going to tell you what you can implement, and not every question is going to be relevant to your team. Without further ado, let's jump in. Do any of you have any training personas that came to mind? I know that some of you in this audience had a face come into your head when I started talking about persona buckets. Maybe it was an email address that comes in too often. Maybe it was even like a custom ringtone, if people still use those. But I want you to write down that person and see if maybe they represent a group of people that you should be catering your trainings towards. I want you to think, are there any critical skills, non-negotiable tasks or workflows that need to be covered in all of your trainings? Maybe there are some specific tasks or skills that are tied to a single persona bucket. This can be a really helpful way to implement some flexibility. Some of these tasks might be critical for some of your users and completely useless for others. For example, this is events for us. Not everybody creates events. But some people, it's all they care about. All right, how do your users go about requesting a training? Maybe you have some kind of automation in place that deals with this. But more importantly, is that information posted somewhere where your users can go about and finding that if they need some kind of help? Something I like to think about also is there a clear avenue for requesting a retraining when they don't log into your CMS for 3 months? Do your users need any permissions access updates before they can even start a training? Ours sometimes happens afterwards, so we don't, but maybe you do. Lastly, is there any preparation that you could ask your users to complete before they come to the training? And again, more importantly, if there is, what happens when they show up and they didn't do their homework? Because that's going to happen, I promise you. Does this mean that triggers like a reschedule for the training? You say, sorry, you didn't do your work, you got to come back. Or maybe it's something that you can cover in like 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning, and that's something I want you to practice 20 times, because you got to be quick at that. Awesome. I see people scribbling. I'm going to move on, though. Hopefully, some of those questions showed up some gaps in your system. Now we're going to jump into the main event. This is the knowledge transfer stage. This is that moment that the whole first stage was preparing you for, so 60 minutes face-to-face. If we go back to our diagram, it's getting even prettier, everybody. It's that middle square, the training itself. But also note that some of it carries over into the way we set up expectations for how we support people after that initial training. We'll come back to that one later in the next stage. What's our surface level task? Well, we're trying to communicate all the information they need. It's got to be clear, thorough, and nobody likes it when a meeting runs long, so we got to do it in the scheduled time. It's dead simple here, right? Even easier for this stage, what's the core goal? This one's super easy because it's the title of the talk. It's in the footer of the slide. Everybody say it with me. We're trying to build user confidence. Okay, I admit that was a little unfair. It was in the footer, but you had to do some I'm sorry. I'm just trying to keep you on your toes. But this is it, right? This is the crux of what we've been discussing the whole time. We need to do everything in our power to make sure that this user or this group of users in front of us right now leaves those 60 minutes with all of the confidence to find the additional information that we decided not to cram in under an hour. In theory, this should be easier, right? We're trying to fit less information into the same amount of time. That's a home run, right? Dead simple. Well, no, you're actually super wrong. It's really, really, really hard to do this because it turns out that every one of our users is going to come in with different expectations. They're going to start with different levels of confidence and familiarity with the tools. And they also might respond very differently to both the information that we're trying to present and the trainer's energy. This is kind of critical. So what's the secret mission that I promised I would give you guys here? What's that technique that's going to magically uplift every user that comes through your doors? Well, it turns out this one's pretty hard too. We're trying to constantly poll our trainee for feedback in order to make ad hoc adjustments to both the manner that we're presenting and the material we're going to cover over the course of the training. We need to be prepared to totally adjust the training on the fly according to the feedback we're reading from our users to give them the best experience and make them feel as confident as possible. The younger generation actually has a term for this that summarizes it best. We're trying to vibe check. We're trying to do a vibe check at all times. We want to become experts in reading the room and picking up what our users are trying to tell us, sometimes quite quietly. How do we do this? How do we get really good at vibe checking? Well, this is really hard, I told you. So you need to be paying attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. Not everyone is going to be offering up verbal feedback in the moment. So we need to make sure that we're leaving space for our users to interject. And when that's not enough, we need to actively solicit that feedback, and we need to hide it. We need to disguise it. So one of my favorite ways to do that is something I call the rapid fire summary. This looks like this. Okay, we just went over the bare minimum of covering all of the required material. We talked a little bit about our core goal of how we build user confidence, and now we're starting to talk about vibe checks. Are there any questions on those 3 things before I move on? This happens to be a really great way to reinforce the material you just covered, while also politely demanding that they actually interact with you, especially over Zoom. The nonverbal cues are pretty tricky here too. Obvious ones include like the eye roll, right? Maybe the scrunched face and furrowed brow. My favorite though is when they really lean into their webcam like this, and you're like they're really trying to focus on what you just clicked on, right? But sometimes they're not so obvious. This might look like they're checking their phone a little too often, looking at the clock. Maybe they're looking to the side of their webcam, like they're distracted. But don't worry, sometimes these cues can be positive as well. It's always great to get a good head bob going. Yeah, we like those. Maybe an here and there. I'm a big finger snapper if you've been in something with me. Oops, sorry. And obviously a laugh here and there never hurts, shows your users are engaged. But these are sometimes even harder to pay attention to through a screen or over Zoom, right? There are thousands of great reasons why a user might not even turn their camera on. What do you do then? And in person, it's not always easier, right? There's space and social cues that you have to pay attention to. It's more subtle body language that comes into play when they're not nicely framed in that webcam. And what do you do about group trainings with multiple users? What happens when you have an outspoken participant, right, who's asking super specific questions? That's verbal feedback. We love those, right? But then we pull the rest of the room, and everybody is silently shouting, "This is not relevant to me. I'm sick of this. I'm checking out. I'm getting bored." That's really difficult. If that sounds too stressful, I'll spare you all the details of that 17-person hybrid training I was telling you about, where it devolved into this exact scenario. It was really hard. But the kicker here is all of this becomes a non-starter if you don't come prepared. You need to know your shit. Because if you're trying to pay attention to all the things we just talked about, and you don't know your material ahead of time, it's not going to go very well. And that user's not going to feel like they have a confident team to back them up. There's a lot to think about, but don't worry, I'm also going to teach you how you can make those adjustments on the fly after you've noticed something. First thing we're going to talk about is depth of content. It can be really hard to strike the right balance here. But sometimes we're going to read the vibe that our user simply isn't picking up what we're putting down. In times like this, I like to show an alternative solution to the same task, but most importantly, I do not move on until they demonstrate some level of confidence in the core foundational skills that we just covered, especially when things need to build on something else. Next, we got the breadth of topics. This can be difficult to juggle, especially when you have lots of skills you're trying to teach someone. So when you're going through a live demonstration and you're navigating software around different topics, it can be really easy for our users to get lost. To give them sort of some handrails, I like to keep things on the demo screen as clean as possible. One example of this, I've been given the feedback that I'm a very fast scroller, and that is very disorienting for users, so I have to actively slow myself down. I know I'm trying to scroll back to the page so I can click view after we made our edits and we saved the page, but sometimes that blur can really throw people off. Another one here is that I like to close tabs when I have more than 3 open. I know you probably have, like, well, how am I ever going to do that? It's okay. It means you have a separate window with the 300 other tabs that you don't have closed, and the user doesn't get to see that. But what they do see is a window full of clean tabs. I even sometimes take a break and say, oh, looks like we have too many tabs open. Let's close down these ones that we had earlier. I let them know so that they know why I'm spending time looking at the tabs across my top. Also, narrating any of the navigation items you click on is critical. And I also think, maybe it goes without saying, vocalizing any keyboard shortcuts you use. You might feel a little silly saying the same thing over and over, but get over it, because your users need to hear that. Maybe they've never encountered this information before, and it's going to go a long way to help them if you just repeat it a few times. All right, next is the easiest one. We need a little break here. We got the pace of our explanation. There's 2 ways we can do this. First, we can speed up. People are going to get really bored and check out if they feel that their content is too rudimentary and not relevant to them. They're like, oh, come on, I'm ready for the next thing. Let's move on. So speed up. Obviously, you have the opposite. You can slow down when you notice a user is just not quite getting it. There are too many of these. Anyway, so once someone feels overwhelmed, it can be really difficult to win them back. So pay attention to this and slow down. Believe it or not, these seem really complicated, right? But here's my favorite one, the one I use the most. This is how we adjust our expectations. Because as we change the pace, the number of topics we're covering, how deep we're going, that's either going to stretch out or collapse the amount of time it's going to take us to share that information with the user, right? So when you notice that you've made all of these adjustments with the other ones, and you're looking at the clock and you notice your timing is way, way off, it's time to check in directly with the user and set some expectations. This might look something like this. Hey, I'm noticing we only have 15 minutes left, which actually is spot on, by the way. And there are a few more topics to cover, but I feel like we're making some really good progress right now, and I don't really want to move on unless you're comfortable. In this case, I might literally offer them a compromise here. Hey, do you want to continue at our current pace? It means we're not going to cover everything. We might have to schedule a follow-up for this to cover the things we don't get to today. Or would you rather we try to hit the gas, get through everything on the agenda today, even if it's not the ideal pace for you? The opportunity for them to take some agency here and choose the best approach for them is going to build that confidence 100% of the time. All right, that's a lot, right? It feels like there's so much to think about in the moment, but don't worry. Remember the personas. Remember the templated training and all that work you did before. Utilize the knowledge that you and your team gathered during the planning and scheduling phase to assess which information specifically for this user or group might be the most elastic, right? You can even skip some things that are not quite as important, or entirely pivot towards another profile, another templated training that you're already an expert on, if the current approach is clearly not working for this person. It's okay. You didn't have to get it right because you've put in the work already. All right, who's ready for some more questions? Pull out the notes, pull out the notes. Answers to these, again, not all of them relevant to everybody, but they're going to fill in some gaps for you. My first one's really easy. How long is your existing training block scheduled for? Do they regularly run long, or do they finish early? If you haven't thought about this, that's a clear place to start. Do you have a designated trainer on your team? This one can get a little contentious and spicy, but how do they get that role? And are they really the best person for the job? Sometimes our most senior and knowledgeable team members are not actually our strongest trainers. You can run into a curse of knowledge scenario where people have so much information that they've started to turn blind to the needs of our most basic non-expert users. So just because they're the most senior doesn't necessarily mean they're the ones who should be interfacing with people who need help. If you have thought critically about who leads your trainings, is there someone who can fill in if that person's unavailable? I'm lucky, I have 3 of those people, but not everybody does. All right, the level of flexibility I've been describing here might not be suitable for all of your processes or the bandwidth of your team or even really your product. So if it doesn't feel flexible to you, maybe there are some subsections within your process where flexibility might make more sense, might be more feasible, or even more useful. I want you to think about this critically in the context of your persona buckets. Maybe there's some flexibility. Maybe that's the only flexibility you introduce into your training system. You have some core things you teach, and then depending on our personas, that's where we introduce this flexibility. Or maybe the whole thing's flexible, like ours. Whatever works best for you. Really importantly though, our last one here, are there any stability, security, or legal concerns that need to inform your training structure? My boss taught me a lot about this one. Currently, make sure that these are being appropriately considered, and if you make any changes to your training process, especially if you're implementing some tips and tricks from a nice DrupalCon presentation, make sure that you're safeguarding these priorities in the long run so you don't impact something that's going to affect these things. Give some time for people to make their notes here. All right, we got 20 minutes. We're golden. We're actually way ahead of schedule. All right, so we got our last phase here. This is the follow-up post-training phase. I like to call it the continuous support stage. And if we come back to our diagram, I promised you it would look good by the end. And here we are. It's really nice and pretty. This starts as soon as the training ends. That's why in those last 2 minutes, we set those expectations with this little red gradient thing. I don't know. It's a mixed metaphor. Sorry. But I think it does well. We're trying to set our users up to take everything they learned in the training and go wild. So what's our surface level task here? Again, these are always really simple. We're trying to keep things running smoothly and step in to provide assistance whenever they need it. What's our core goal here? Well, we're trying to empower our newly trained users to grow their knowledge and confidence at their own pace, sometimes without our involvement at all. They're going to do this by interacting with our documentation, maybe direct contact with someone from the training team. Another reason why it's really helpful to have both a trainer and someone who's scheduling those things, because if they're sick of my face, they have someone else they can go to and talk to. And most importantly, for us, other trained users, people who already know this stuff, can teach each other and take some of that workload off ourselves. Now that they have the knowledge to reach out to the right people and the confidence to ask thoughtful questions whenever they're in good company, we can trust, with the guardrails we put in place, they're going to move on and learn at their own pace. So the hidden objective here is a little abstract. It's the first time that our objective is less focused on this single user and more about how we collect feedback on ways to improve both our training process and the product as a whole. So we're trying to leverage the relationship we just built with this person in these 60 minutes and the brief email communications they had before we talked to them to make sure we're checking in with them to improve both of these things. This is the end goal, right? And this is the most abstract phase of the 3 we've talked about today. This phase is going to look the most different from each team. We'll leave that there. Each team who tries to implement it. And so instead of doing a huge deep dive here, I have a couple concrete examples of things that we use that work really well. I'm going to show you those. We can talk about them. And then I got 3 full slides of questions that might give you some ideas on what you can implement for your process. Let's jump in. The first thing here is that follow-up email template I talked about. The first thing to note here is it's short, it's really direct, and it's pleasant. We're asking them to reach out, but we're not demanding they reach out. We don't necessarily want them to reach out if they don't need help. We want them to find their information elsewhere. So I don't expect you to read all of this, but I'll draw your attention first. We have a survey link at the top. We have all of the documentation notes in those little links in the middle that I promised in those 2 minutes at the end of the training. And then lastly, we have a nice sign off. Hey, check in with us if you need anything. We don't want this to be a burden on their inbox, but we do want to encourage them and let them know we're here to help. Another way we do this is something I really love. It's called our Bugs Feedback channel on Slack. This is super informal, but we find that it's really transparent. And sometimes the opportunity cost to writing an email to that really annoying trainer who wouldn't shut up for 60 minutes is just not what people want to do. But when you have an active channel like this, they see other people saying, hey, I need help with this. This seems like a bug to me. And sometimes it's not a bug, and we help them out. But other times, it's a bug, and we need to fix that. So it's really helpful. We actually rotate our bug squasher responsibilities among the development team. So every week, a different developer has a responsibility to respond to these. We proudly brag that we have a less than 1 hour response time. And we make absolutely no promises that we're going to solve any of your problems in an hour. But we do promise that we'll keep you updated and we'll respond pretty quickly. So you know we're working on it. As you can see here, I responded in July to this user, Michelle. I I responded to her in roughly 2 minutes after she asked for a question, and we found out that this was a bug. We had a fix roughly 6 hours later, and it went out the next morning on our deployment. So this is public to all of our trained users. It's a layer of transparency that we find works really well for our team, and it encourages people to reach out when they have questions. This works really well for us if you don't do deployments quite as quickly. Maybe it doesn't fit your system. So let's get into those questions I was advertising before, and we'll see if there are any things that you're not thinking of that you might be able to implement. We got 3 full slides of these, so buckle up. The first one's on logistics, entirely on logistics. Do you have a follow-up communication template? Is it up to date? And do you know who on your team is responsible for sending that communication? If you don't, that might be something to assign pretty quickly. Also, do your users know to expect this communication? Because this is going to be the bridge between the training phase and this indefinite long-term support phase. Really critical connection there. What happens when a user has a follow-up question during the training that you weren't able to answer? Who's responsible for getting back to the user on those follow-up questions? How are they being tracked for both the user's purposes, so that they get their answer, but also for feedback purposes? Because if you're answering the same question after your training every single time, that's something you want to address in the trainings. You want to internalize that feedback, internalize this pattern, and address it in your training structure. Again, who's responsible for finding that answer and getting back to them? Sometimes it can be really helpful to just set those roles. Next, do you track any training statistics, like when users are trained, on which date, who was present, and how is this information both stored and being used? Here's a little spoiler. If it's being stored and it's not being used, stop collecting it because you're wasting your time. We're trying to save you as much labor as possible here so that you can do the best job for your users instead of wasting time on other processes. All right, next is about community messaging. Do you have a space for users who have completed a training? Is that space stale? I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but sometimes a dead space is worse than no space at all. If a user comes in, they feel that no one's posted there in the last 9 months, they're not going to be the first ones to break that ice, and you're going to stop people from reaching out instead of encouraging it. Is it difficult for your team to maintain that space? Is it worth your time? If you're doing a lot of work to keep that space up and running and getting relatively little return on that investment, again, knock it off. You're wasting your time. All right, are there other opportunities for our users to seek help without undergoing a full training process? These can look like a number of things, so I'm going to throw down some examples of what you might try. Obviously, we have direct lines of contact to the training team. We talked about these. This can look like email, Slack, Teams, whatever you choose to use. But again, when a user reaches out directly, how are you logging that feedback so that it informs updates to your training process? We had a dead end here, and it was me. People reached out to me because some of them liked me. They enjoyed the way that we interacted, and I was able to solve problems for them in like 5 minutes, and sometimes it would take them an hour of knocking their head against the Drupal brick wall. They weren't getting very far. But I'm not very good about logistics. So I was answering their questions, but I wasn't really logging those interactions. We found that I had solved the same problem for 6 people, and I didn't tell anyone I did it. So we actually implemented a way that we communicate within the product team so that when someone asks out for questions, they know about that. Even if the user doesn't know about that, again, think about those hidden techniques so that we can make updates to our training process. Next, I really recommend an open office hours situation. This can be really helpful. It wasn't helpful for us, but it can be really helpful. We floated this idea for a while. We did it for about 3 months, and I think 4 users showed up in those 3 months, and we did it every 2 weeks. So we found that this regular attendance was not worth the time that we were investing in it, and we stopped. But it might be useful to you. I was talking with my friend John Bacozzi. He was telling me about a huge feature launch yesterday where they had office hours every week for like 3 weeks, and those were all full. And it worked really well for them, especially around those new feature releases. So this could work for you, even though it didn't work for us. Think about if it's something that would improve your workflow. Next, this is sort of like a meta context for these. Are maintaining any of these alternative pathways becoming really burdensome for your team? Or is the opposite true? Could adding any one of them actually improve the pathways that your users are finding to get the information they need, and in turn, reducing the workload on you as trainers? This might let you practice new templated trainings or focus your efforts elsewhere. Just do less trainings in general because your users are accessing the information already. Lastly, when you make a change to your system that alters functionality users were previously trained on, how are you remembering to make changes to your training process, and how are you communicating that to users? Because if they've been trained on one thing, you change that, and they're still doing it the old way, that's frustration, that's a collapse of communication, that confidence is going to erode. Last one here. I know we're getting a little long in the tooth with all these questions, but I promise this is our last one. Do you have a feedback survey? Ours is dead simple. It's 3 questions. But does everyone on your training team know how to access the responses for this survey? And how often is the survey actually being completed by your users? Maybe it's too long. Or maybe you're not actually getting any useful feedback from it if it's only 3 questions. Maybe it is. So think about how you might adjust that. Here's one that sometimes summons some pangs of dread. Do you have a process for updating your documentation regularly? This could be its own 50-minute DrupalCon talk. But one thing I recommend to keep it reined in and focused on trainings here is if a documentation section that's called like a training refresher. This can be like a first stop for our users who haven't logged in for a really long period of time, and they don't want to reach out, they don't want to post in a channel, they don't want to send an email, but they think they might be able to get that information quickly. A training refresher section can be a really nice pathway for them to just focus on what they need to get the basics of a training. Next, do you collect any metrics about how your documentation is used? I know I'm a real broken record here, but if you're finding that people are going back to the same page, so always the first page of your documentation they visit, this is something you need to put back into your trainings because it's clearly not being covered enough. Again, if you are collecting metrics and you're not using them, stop collecting them. I'm sorry, I know I'm saying the same things over and over, but I'm trying to save you time. All right, do you have any post-training check-in milestones? And are you thinking critically about when those are? Maybe it should be before 3 months so that a user doesn't go 3 months without checking in. Is that timeline strategic? And if you have it in place already, is it working well? Just make that determination for yourself. And one final time, how are you using those final check-ins to solicit further feedback on both your process for how you train those users and the pain points in your system that aren't working? This one is critical. It's why it's our last question of the whole talk, because this is where you're going to get those junior power users telling you all about the things they hate that you might be able to fix, or setting the expectations that they're not going to get fixed and they have to get used to it. That's true as well. So hopefully, with all of those questions, leading questions, you found some gaps in your system. Not all of them are relevant, but maybe 1 or 2 things here that you can implement into your existing process that are going to make it better for your users. So to wrap it up here, I like to come back to my favorite slide that I've talked about the whole time. Here it is in all its glory. I like to end on this visual because when people imagine a training process, they're typically only thinking about that red box in the middle, right? How many people were thinking about before and after training before this talk, right? But as you can see here, the pre-planning phase, that scheduling phase, learning as much about our users, getting prepared for what we're going to teach them and what they might need, and then how we support them on the back end is going to go a long way to help your non-expert users feel both more confident in your web tools and your team and the ecosystem they work in as a whole. Thanks, everybody. Looks like I nailed it. I'm like a minute and a half under. But I'm here if anyone has questions. Please don't hesitate. Go ahead. Oh, the 3 questions in our survey are, who did you train with? What section were you trained on? And an open-ended, how was the experience? Next.
In terms of the training itself, does the level of technicality and detail you get into depend on the persona you're
100%.
Because I find myself trying to explain like relations and
Yeah.
tags and things like that.
Yeah.
I think it's important, but I guess
No, that's a classic thing that you would want to see as elastic. You want to maybe make a determination about that user beforehand if you can get enough information, put them in a persona bucket, and have a template training that teaches that information and one that doesn't. And then you can switch between those on the fly when you're getting feedback from your user and you're seeing, oh, maybe it is relevant to them. They need to learn it, but it's too much for them to learn in an hour. That's possible too. Great question. What's up?
You mentioned that you don't like to move on until they've demonstrated confidence in what they're doing.
Yeah.
How do you manage when someone's visibly frustrated
Mm.
and they're encouraging you to move on and they don't want to be a burden?
Sure, yeah. So the question there, just because the mask made it somewhat hard to hear. When someone is clearly demonstrating, we're getting feedback from them, that they're frustrated, there's more to cover in the training, they want you to move on because they're feeling a little bit of embarrassment or frustration, tension. And how do you manage that? This one's really tricky, especially in a group training, especially when it's hybrid, and someone doesn't want to move on. So again, that's where I would start managing expectations immediately. I would try to notice, hey, whoa, there's some tension here. It's okay if we don't cover all this here. Again, I would reassure them, we're here to help. Is there an immediate task that you need to solve that we can just cover in these next 20 minutes? And we could show you how we can handhold you through that. And then you could try some of that on your own in the future. And the next time you bump into something you don't know how to do, they're going to feel like, oh, I was really supported in those 20 minutes. I actually solved 3 things I thought were going to take me like 2 hours. And so when they come up with the next thing that is not going to, or they don't feel comfortable doing on their own, they're going to use one of the avenues we presented to reach out, and we can help them again. And then maybe with a little bit more familiarity with the system, they're now in a new persona bucket, and we can try and cover more information or something like that, because they've got that level of core confidence that we were able to help them through. Great question. Next, anybody else? Go ahead.
Do you recommend doing like multiple trainings if you have 2 basically different types of topics? Because we need to teach people writing style
Yeah.
guidelines as well as the technical aspect of working with our site.
This is a great question. What do we do when we have like 2 core skill sets that seem disparate and like we're still the same training team that does both of them, right? This is a case where I really personally benefit from my product team. I don't do a lot of content strategy with them. Even though I have a technical writing degree, my career focus has been development, and I just don't feel like I could teach someone that in an appropriate amount of time. So we'll cover the basics. We might even set some expectations mid-training, like, oh, this is a bit of a content strategy perspective. Hopefully, if one of my product team members is with me, they'll jump in and answer the question immediately. Or they'll say, hey, this is something that doesn't quite fit in this hour. I'm going to schedule a training with just Karen. Karen's going to help you with this, and she'll take over these writing tasks. So I would either, if you don't have 2 trainers, I would recommend separating those 2 things. This is like a content strategy training versus a functionality or usability training. And try to keep those 2 skill sets really different, unless you found a user who's really familiar with one of them already. Then you might be able to combine those 2 things and accelerate the functionality if they've demonstrated that they're like a junior power user or something like that. And you can sort of teach them alongside each other, but I certainly wouldn't do that for every training. Does that help? Awesome. Anybody else? Thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it. Here's your non-technical, technical talk about trainings at DrupalCon. Thank you, everybody.